The philosophers whom we're reading this week, are sometimes called pre-Socratic. After reading Malcolm X, I personally stopped using that term because I thought it was reducing their importance to just that they happened to be before Socrates, another philosopher whom we're going to study. I think they are much more important than that. And I also appreciate how Malcolm X points out the real diversity of Western philosophy. People like to joke that philosophy is all about dead white men. No, it's not. These guys were from around the Mediterranean Sea. There were probably various shades of brown, although the sculptures we have are marble, so they look pale. But they weren't like, they're not dead white men. So I now refer to them as the Mediterranean philosophers, but you probably won't see that anywhere else. If you look it up or on Google or an encyclopedia, it'll probably say something like pre-Socratic. So just be aware of that. So we're looking at the beginnings of Western philosophy in the ancient Mediterranean world, the roots of our civilization, going back about 2.5 millennia. And what I want to just contemplate very briefly is the shift from a more mythical way of thinking to what we would call science, but what used to be called, Gabe, natural philosophy. Looks like he's buried in the skull. So you probably all learned about myths in ancient Greece and Rome, gods and goddesses influencing nature and human life. Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet, put together one of the first attempts to kind of systematize all of the Greek beliefs in a poem called the Theogony. And he writes first about these primordial beings called Earth and Sky, Uranos and Gaia. And they were originally basically having sex. The sky was on top of the earth having sex. And so there's a story that he tells, some ancient myth. We would think it's a crazy story, that Uranos fathered all these children with Gaia, got her pregnant multiple times. But each time a baby would pop out, please forgive me, this is a little bit disgusting, he didn't like the baby. He'd stuff it back inside of her because he didn't like the babies. She got upset because this was painful, and she's got all these babies stuffed back inside of her, and he keeps getting her pregnant again and again and again. It hurts. She's getting full. So she gives a knife to one of the babies that's still inside of her belly. She gives him a knife. It's Kronos. Kronos is the name of this child. And so the next time Uranos, the sky, wants to have sex with her, the earth, Kronos cuts off as you know what, and that's the end of it. And that was how the earth and sky became separated, creating the space that we see as the universe. And these two divine beings, Uranos and Gaia, become the parents of all the other gods and ultimately of us and of all living things. It's the beginning of this long creation narrative. Okeanos is a deity that you'll see in the reading, I think under Thales. Some people in the ancient world, and in the mythical world, thought of the earth as flat. That's the most logical inference, right? The sun rises in the east, it sets in the west, you see the horizon. They thought there was a river encircling the entire world. They called that Okeanos. But it also had the qualities of a divine being. So you'll see that in Thales. And then there were the more familiar Greek gods and goddesses. Apollo, the god of the sun, who supposedly got into his chariot in the morning and drove his chariot across the sky, and the wheel of his chariot is the sun, sort of traversing the sky from east to west every day. The goddesses called the Muses, who inspired poets. People in the ancient world, and many indigenous peoples today, including my relatives, believe that poetry that is orally spoken is divinely inspired. An ancestor or a god or a goddess inspires you to speak. If you've ever seen Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, you can see something like that. At some point he stops reading and he looks up. And from a Christian perspective, this is the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit just inspires him to speak and he goes on extemporaneously. And that's the really famous part of the speech. But indigenous peoples and people in the ancient world believed that some divine being inspired poetry and song. Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, she's familiar. Zeus, the king of the gods, with his lightning bolt. Supposedly when you saw lightning, that was Zeus throwing a spear. Right? So it's a mythical understanding of the world. Divine beings kind of infuse the world, and they influence natural events, and they influence our lives. So what we could call a mythical worldview. The Mediterranean philosophers came along, with Thales being one of the earliest, and they kind of started to shift away from that view toward a view that was more rational, based on observations and inferences. So there are sort of three key terms to think about here. And this shift is sometimes called the Great Awakening, a real change in worldview that took place maybe about a millennium and a half ago, maybe around the 500s BC. Three key terms: logos, or reason. That's the thinking part of us. Logos, or reason, it refers to our minds, as opposed to our emotions, the heart, the part of us that feels, or our physical desires, hunger, thirst, lust, desire for chocolate, so physical desires, right? So there's a greater emphasis on human reason, that thinking part of ourselves. And there's the idea that the universe has order. So things happen not because of the whims of the gods, who could change their minds if they wanted to, but things have order. There are patterns, and we can see the patterns. We can predict them. The patterns repeat themselves. Things fit together and make sense. The universe has order, and the key word there is cosmos. The Greek word cosmos means order. And so what the Mediterranean philosophers were looking for was, each of them in his own way was searching for the basic explanatory key that would unlock an understanding of all of reality. In English, we would call this a first principle. Principle, or first principle. In Greek, arche. So each philosopher had a different idea of what the arche, or first principle, or explanatory key of everything was. And they tried to use that idea to create a systematic or unified understanding of the world as a whole, from nature to human life. Think back for a moment to that very first journal question I asked you to write about. That second question, how do you relate to the world around you? This is part of the answer. How do we, as individuals, look out at the world around us and make sense out of it? That is part of philosophy and part of what these guys were doing. So we would call this the beginnings of scientific inquiry, the search for an explanatory cause that can tell us why things happen. So we start to look at lightning as a natural phenomenon that has causes that we can explain. It's not a god throwing a spear at random. Something happened. Now we say an electric charge built up between the clouds and the earth. And when the charge becomes strong enough, a spark jumps across the gap, and that's lightning. So again, the Mediterranean philosophers used inference. And as you read, think about what observations they might have been making that would have led them to draw the conclusions that they do. Why would they think that? What were they seeing in the natural world, in human life, that led them to draw the conclusions they did? Here's an example of a philosopher that's not in your reading, but I just love this as one of the achievements of the ancient world. Eratosthenes was an African philosopher. He lived in the ancient city of Alexandria in Egypt. And the image on there is a map that one of my students made to show this achievement. So we've got the Mediterranean Sea to the north, kind of like Lake Michigan for us. And then Egypt is here. Large country just south of the Mediterranean Sea. Italy is way north. So Eratosthenes, great name, lived in an ancient city called Alexandria. But he knew someone who lived in Syene, hundreds of miles to the south. So there are these two cities, kind of spaced widely apart. And he observed, one of my little clips fell off. Eratosthenes observed that at a certain time of day and a certain time of year at noon, the sun is exactly overhead, and a vertical stick would cast no shadow. And then he observed that as the season wears on and the sun gets lower in the south, at noon the sticks start to cast shadows. So, does somebody have a cell phone with a flashlight feature? Can you pull that out and be the sun for us? I'm going to shut the lights off for just a minute so we can illustrate it. So, come on over here. Everybody get up and get out of your seats for a minute. You know, I know, you probably think you're nuts. But just take a look at this. It's amazing. Okay, so hold the light up there, far enough away that you can see the shadows of the sticks and they're about equal. A little bit further away. We have a gentleman who can do that?
Yes, I can.
We got Mario here. Okay, so let's see. Now the sun is so far away from the earth that when its rays hit the earth, they're effectively parallel. They run alongside of each other. They don't spread out. So one would expect that at the same time of day, with the sun in the sky, the shadow of a stick in Alexandria would be the same length as the shadow of a stick in Syene. They'd be the same. But Eratosthenes, because he had a friend in Syene, observed that that is not the case. In fact, the shadow of the stick in Syene is longer. If the earth is flat, that makes no sense. Eratosthenes was among the first to infer that, in fact, the surface of the earth is curved. You see how this shadow is shorter than this one? This was how people discovered that the earth is round, sticks and shadows, an inference based on observations. And then he paid someone to pace out the distance from Alexandria to Syene so he could figure out exactly how far that was, and using angles, he calculated the circumference of the earth, like how big the earth is around. And his number wasn't too far off. So this is an example, just to be aware of Eratosthenes of Alexandria, a millennium and a half ago, figured out the earth is round just from looking at shadows. Amazing. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Jessica. Extra points for you guys. Okay. Thank you for your patience with my silly little demonstration. Let me talk real quick through the philosophers who are in the rest of your handout. So again, they're all from the ancient Mediterranean world. Africa, Asia, and Europe, surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. This is a closer-up view. Italy, Greece, Ionia, which is the coast of Turkey, and North Africa. Some of them traveled to Syria, and some of them just traveled around the ancient world, absorbing knowledge from various places. Be aware that this is where they were from. You don't have to memorize the birthplace of every philosopher. I don't even remember all those. But just if I show you a map on the final exam, you can sort of circle this area as the place where these guys were from. Okay. So these are the four philosophers we're going to be studying. Listen to their strange names. And this is how we pronounce them today in English. Thales, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Democritus. You can always look them up on dictionary.com or something in your phone. Whenever you run across a word you don't know, look up the pronunciation. You guys have such a great tool. You can figure out how anything is pronounced that way. You'll probably correct me. Thales of Miletus is sometimes called the father of Western philosophy. According to Aristotle, he was among the first thinkers to begin thinking scientifically, to make observations and form inferences instead of just attributing everything to the gods. He was a mathematician, and you're going to see some math in the reading, and he was an astronomer. Apparently he wrote a book called The Nautical Star Guide. Do you guys know what navigation is? Okay, good. It's guiding yourself, but in the ancient world, and even still today out at sea, sailors use the stars to figure out where they are and what direction they're headed in. And Thales helped figure out how to do this. For example, that the North Star or Pole Star, which is that way, never moves. So if you can find a North Star, you can orient yourself, you know where you're going. He was the original absent-minded professor. There's a story in your reading about a servant girl named Thrata who was laughing at Thales because he was looking up at the stars and he tripped over something that was in front of him. So he was your classic book smart, not street smart person. But he was also an engineer and a problem solver. There's a story, and I put this in your reading, about how he helped a wealthy king get an army across a river. See if you can figure it out. What was it that Thales did? He also predicted or projected one year that there was going to be a really big olive crop. Olives are these little fruits that grow on trees in the Mediterranean, and people squish them to make olive oil, which they use for everything. So he predicted that one year there's going to be this huge crop of olives. So he bought as many olive presses, the machines you use to make the oil, as he could find. And then when the harvest came, everybody wanted to rent his olive presses, and he made a lot of money. So he was a smart guy, an engineer and an investor, as well as a thinker. He was all these things. He was the first to investigate the underlying cause, arche, or basic principle of all things. He thought everything is water. Ultimately, everything is made of water. And as you go through the reading, see if you can make sense out of that. Why would he have thought that? I think personally that this is meaningful today simply because water is so important to our lives. We happen to be sitting on top of the world's largest supply of fresh water in the Great Lakes, and right now we're not taking care of it. These are some of the groups that are protesting to protect our water. Short lecture, I won't do that again. Okay. Second guy, Pythagoras of Samos. He was fascinated with math. His idea was that the arche of everything is numbers. He thought that math explains everything. He began this discovery, or this process, with the discovery of the fact that the musical intervals, the differences between musical notes, are formed by whole number ratios. This little demonstration will give us a barbaric look at that fact. The note gets lower as the glass gets more full. And if you measure it, exactly half the glass would be an exact octave. If you're a musician, you know that the intervals are the differences between musical notes. They're formed by whole number ratios, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 3. And Pythagoras was the first person to figure that out. The idea that math describes the natural world is the basis of the physical sciences today. We have equations for everything. But Pythagoras was the first person to figure that out, and it was an eye-opening discovery, new at the time. Why should that be? Why should numbers describe the world? But they do. He discovered this. He also thought that philosophy wasn't just something you study, it's a way of life. And he founded a community. His interest in musical harmony, you'll see, I think, in the reading, carried over to his concern for preserving harmony in relationships. Much of the reading is devoted to a consideration of friendships and how to maintain friendships and various relationships peacefully. See whether you agree or disagree with him. There are things to debate in there. See what you think. A Pythagoras idea of harmony in relationships. Then we've got Heraclitus of Ephesus. Ephesus is in present-day Turkey, or Ionia. He wrote in aphorisms, short little sayings that were probably meant to be spoken orally, memorized by the students, and kind of pondered. Some of them are kind of like riddles. For example, time is a child playing. Well, what does that mean? So you can pick up the reading, look at one of these little aphorisms, and then just kind of ponder it for a while as you go about your day. That's probably what they were meant for. In a sense, his reading is the easiest to do because you can kind of skip around. You don't have to read it front to back. So he wrote in aphorisms. His idea that the arche of everything is change. Everything changes. Nothing stays the same. And he's famous for the quote, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Even we, from moment to moment, are changing, both physically and spiritually and emotionally and intellectually as we grow. are we the same person that we were yesterday? Heraclitus would say no, so we could debate that as well. But he thought this change is orderly, according to reason. It's not random. And there are places in the reading where he talks about things going through phases. Earth becomes water, water becomes air, water becomes air, and I think he says air becomes soul. So he sees the human soul as part of this natural cycle, and he meditates occasionally upon death and what it is. Because he focuses on death, people sometimes call him the weeping philosopher. Last but not least, Democritus, whose ideas will probably seem the most familiar to us. He disagreed with Heraclitus. He did not think that everything changes. He thought that what is most real is permanent. It stays the same forever. But what's permanent are these teeny tiny little particles that you can't really see. He called them atoms, from the Greek word atomos, which means uncuttable. So think about cutting a pizza. If I had one pizza and maybe it was just me and Reyes, we cut it in half, no problem, right?
I'll probably give you a quarter.
Yeah, we'd have to fight over that. It would be a lot harder to cut it up for everyone in this room, right? The pieces would be way smaller. Imagine continuing the cutting for like 100 people. And so this was kind of a thought experiment on the part of Democritus. Again, no one has ever seen an atom. Let me repeat that. Even today, with the most powerful microscopes, we can see large molecules, but no one has ever seen an atom. That picture in your grade school textbooks of a nucleus with electrons spinning around it, no one has ever seen that. It is an inference based upon the behaviors of things that we can see, like candles and water, and chemicals mixing together and doing various things. So his inference was everything's atoms. Atoms never changed. He thought the universe was eternal. It has no beginning and no ends. The atoms have always existed. They just combine and recombine. And that's kind of mind-blowing to think about. If you just like pinch part of your flesh and think, oh my gosh, 1 billion years ago, where was this? In the body of a dinosaur? Or fish poop. It was fish poop. At some point, every single one of the molecules in our body was probably poop. If we think about it, our bodies are these temporary coming together of atoms, which are just going to fly apart and disappear back into the universe. So his idea, Democritus' idea, was that what is real is what is totally physical. Right? Matter, that's it. Soul, spirit, it's not really a concern. Gods, probably not. So see in each of these readings what the various thinkers thought about the gods or the divine. We have different opinions. Okay. So this is our reading, the Mediterranean Philosophers. So there are selections from, they're called fragments, little bits and pieces rescued from various ancient manuscripts by researchers. If any of these guys have their own original writings, those have been lost. These are all kind of secondhand, and they all wrote in Greek. So just be aware that what we're reading is a translation of an ancient language. In those places where I can get a hold of the Greek text, I will, so that if we have questions about what something means, I might be able to find the Greek behind the text. Read it and annotate. Complete your 3 posts. Again, next class will split into 2 groups. Group 2 is doing their reading session of this reading, the Mediterranean Philosophers, but in room 300. Group 1 has their seminar here. Let me know if you have any questions about the posts. See me after. We'll stop in a couple minutes and just see me if you have questions about anything. But do this in your journal. Part of what you're going to do at the end of the semester, you're going to take a written exam where I'll ask you to be able to summarize in writing who the major philosophers were whom we read for seminar, when they lived, what they accomplished, something about them. Start that now by putting in your journal a strong paragraph, at least 7 complete and meaningful sentences about these guys. Who were the Mediterranean philosophers? What does it mean to talk about a shift from myth to natural philosophy? Write in your own words, but include some details and terms from the lecture. When you're done, turn in your journal and you're free to go. Again, just see me if you have questions about anything. And then Danielle, we need to take care of that, okay?